Field Notes on Democracy, you talk about a change in India at the end of the Cold War and two things starting simultaneously, an overt alliance with the United States and the rise of Hindu nationalism. Are they connected? Have they worked together? How do you see them?
Very much so. You know, I see it as that in 1989, in those bleak mountains of Afghanistan, when capitalism won its jihad against Soviet communism, a lot of things changed in the world. And in my part of the world, what happened was the Indian government realigned itself to the US. And today it calls itself a natural ally of the US and Israel. Around that time, you know, it was as though the government opened two locks. One was the lock of the Indian market, and it became a free market. And the other was the lock of this old 17th century mosque called the Babri Masjid, which the Hindu nationalists said has to be demolished because it's the birthplace of the god Ram. And simultaneously, when these two locks were opened, it was as though two kinds of totalitarianism were released into the country. One was this kind of economic totalitarianism bordering on a kind of fascism. And the other was Hindu right-wing totalitarianism bordering on fascism. And it's interesting that both these processes have produced their own quote-unquote terrorists or terrorisms. So you have Islamist terrorism, and you have what's called the Maoist terrorists now. And between the two major political parties in India, the BJP and the Congress, they sort of prioritize these terrorisms in different ways. But they use both to further militarize the state. And in Parliament, what you have is the opposition as well as the ruling party is always right-wing, you know. So it's sort of colonized politics in a kind of way. And what you see is a situation where you have, I mean, in 2002 you had a genocide against Muslim people in Gujarat, where more than 2,000 people were slaughtered on the streets, and women were raped, and 150,000 were driven from their homes. And today, the chief minister, who was chief minister at the time, when the police were helping the rioters, he was voted to power several times, and it's his third session in power. And the biggest industrialists in India, Ratan Tata and the Ambanis, have actually publicly endorsed him as a prime ministerial candidate. So you see the connection between the two, you know. And for both people, this kind of hollowing out of democracy and turning it into a military state becomes important. The Home Minister said recently that he envisions an India where 85% of the population lives in cities, which means roughly 500 million people being persuaded or forced to move off their land.
You've used a number of incendiary words. I know that you don't use them casually, but I think that they require explanation and defense. You talked about the free market explosion in India, the enviable growth rate, the Indian miracle as it's seen in the mainstream media around the world, being a kind of totalitarian economic system bordering on fascism. That's a strong enough statement that I need you to defend it, because nobody else, you know, talks about India that way.
Because India is a market, you know, and it's a market which has created a kind of middle class, which is a hugely consuming middle class, which buys cars and ACs and TVs and
it's many, many people because of the
many.
size
I mean,
of
even if it's a small percentage, it's millions of people. But what has happened on the other side is that the majority of the population lives in conditions of extreme malnutrition. The food grain intake in some places is lower than sub-Saharan Africa. 180,000 farmers caught in debt have committed suicide. And there's a kind of devastation of the ecology. You have probably the largest internally displaced population in the world. You know, just 30 million displaced by big dams alone. And
you trace all of this to the post-Cold War ascent of the market forces in India?
Well, post-Cold War, actually this kind of centralized development model was also a Soviet model. But this structural adjustment and privatization has has just put it on steroids, so it's gone through the roof. And a lot of the growth rate is actually driven by things like mining, which is a very artificial way of pushing up a country's growth rate. It doesn't necessarily affect the development index. So if you look at the UN development index, India is right at the bottom of the pile, So that's what I mean.
Despite this roaring growth.
Yes, despite the roaring growth. Despite the fact that you've got, more millionaires now than the US or China. Mm-hmm. You also have the largest population of malnutrition children, malnutrition people who by any index would count as living in conditions of near famine.
Now, you've also talked about the slaughter of Muslims in Gujarat as a genocide.
Yes.
That, again, is a very explosive term. It's a very technical term. Why do you use that word?
It's a technical term, and if you look at the UN definition of genocide, you will see that it actually, is a word that you could use. And if you look at the rhetoric of the Hindu right, if you look at the RSS, which is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the sort of cultural guild of the BJP, they openly talk about how much they admire Hitler and how Muslims should be second-class citizens and all of that.
At this tumultuous moment in the conversation, we have